About as ready as I'm gonna get. Okay, well, everybody, welcome. Thank you. My name is Abrar. I'm a teacher in Tulsa. I have a certificate in U.S. history, geography, stuff like that. That's what I majored in college. And we had this idea, maybe 3 or 4 months ago now, to do a proper in-depth study program for not just American history, but philosophy, for all kinds of different stuff. But we wanted to start here with that, just because we think that historical education is lacking in this country, and everybody wants to know more, but they don't really know how to start. So today we want to start. And we're going to start today by talking about the antebellum period in American history through the Civil War, and we'll end right around a little bit after where Reconstruction ended. But before we begin, let's just, and I'm going to put us in presenter mode. Before we begin, let's just quickly talk about the purpose of this program. The first thing that we got to understand is that this isn't a course about American history. Really, it's a course about history and teaching people to be historians. That's why this lecture portion is going to get you almost no actual subject knowledge, not to a level that I would say is acceptable for a high school student. It is mainly just going to be review. The actual fun portion, in my opinion, of this program is going to be practicing and learning skills regarding history, being historians, doing critical analysis with history. I have a picture up here of W.E.B. Du Bois, who is often considered the founder of American sociology and probably the greatest historian of Reconstruction era America, at least until the 80s and 90s. And the point here is not really to get us a 100% understanding of all the dates and all the places and who did what, when, and where. The point here is to understand history as a living and breathing entity that stays with us. And because of that, has deep, deep political implications for everything we want to do. So at the end of this, hopefully we should all be thinking more and more like critical historical materialists. Now, okay, what is historical materialism? The long answer you can find in this book, or in several German books. But the real answer is nobody knows what it is. It is something that we feel in our hearts and something we do. And beyond that, trying to explain what historical materialism or dialectical materialism is to anybody is a fool's errand, in my opinion. But we can have a few different landmarks, and excuse me, I'll mute myself as well. We can have a few different landmarks and ideas, let's call them schema, for how we analyze any situation that will help us move along through understanding any historical situation. Honestly, dialectical materialism, historical materialism, I think of it much more as studying music or something like that. It's something you need to be able to see it and hear it, and it's not something that you can give one definition to. But I tried to give a definition, and that's about as much as I could come up with for somebody with absolutely no subject matter knowledge, right? We're going to try to look at history as a result of definite struggles, meaning struggles that happen in one place and one time, between groups of people. And those groups of people are going to be overwhelmingly determined by their relationship to the economy or to production. And we call those relationships class relationships. Okay, so what does that actually mean, though? The point of this really is to get us to understand it at the very end. So here's all I really need you guys to stick with me on. Number one is that we all understand human beings live in social groups. We live within social groups and within certain contexts, which means I wasn't born in 1666. I was born in 2004 America. And I am speaking right now in English. I don't get to decide what my native language is. I don't get to decide when I was born, and I don't get to decide what cultural context, birthed my consciousness. None of us get to do that, and therefore, when we want to analyze the historical situation, anything really, we need to get it together, or get a grip on the fact that any situation is being deeply, deeply affected by everything that happened 30 years ago, that happened 60 years ago, that happened 70 years ago, that keeps on happening, right? These social groups that human beings live in, because of the fact that we live in a natural environment, because of the fact that resources are limited, we have to interact with that environment, right? We have to get water from a stream, we have to hunt animals or whatever. Whatever our method of obtaining the means of subsistence are in that society, human beings are going to form social relationships based on that, on how we subsist with ourselves. Those relationships, combined with the interaction with the economy, is what we call the material conditions of a society. The conditions of a society can be both material and immaterial. The conditions, what we really mean here to say is the context of a society, is deeply determined first, obviously, by the ways in which that society reproduces itself, but also in the cultural context in which that society comes from. That broadly, we can call this a distinction between the base and the superstructure. If there are Marxists or developed Marxists in the audience, who I assume they are, who want to describe it in that way. But what we are essentially doing as historians is we are analyzing both the material conditions as well as all other conditions of that society and trying to determine what about that, what is changing, what is new, what is influenced by what came before, and what is influencing what's coming after it, right? And as a very smart presidential candidate once said, you are born in the context of everything that came around you. You did not fall out of a coconut tree. And because of that, we have to study history, right? Now, here's what you really got to get. Nothing is stagnant, right? Honestly, if I wanted to do this my way, I would start with the Big Bang. I would make this a physics course, number one. And then we'd go through evolution, we'd go through the development of our genus, we'd go through everything. Because things do not stay the same, but things are not created either. Nothing comes from nothing. Things have to come from something. So if we're going to try to understand anything, we got to understand that whatever somebody is thinking, what their consciousness is, what we call their consciousness, what their beliefs are totally and completely, not just deeply, totally created by the conditions in which they live. I cannot, let me explain it this way. I cannot have a thought that somebody in 2060 is going to have. I cannot have a new thought that somebody in 2060 is going to have. It's physically impossible for me to do that, which means I am limited by the conditions I set forth. Whatever explanation I give you guys today about anything, it's kind of wrong, because in 30 or 40 years, conditions will have changed, and that explanation will no longer be relevant. So, again, if you are confused, the number one thing we just got to remember is that when we're looking at something, ask yourself, okay, what is the material benefit for somebody, or material harm that's happening to somebody in this instance? Because that is the number one thing that influences human social making decisions. And then if you still can't understand why something is happening, then consider the fact that I'm speaking English and I didn't choose that I'm speaking English, and that the traditions, or as Marx said, the traditions of dead generations live upon the living like a nightmare. Something like this, right? Okay, so, if I can get it to keep going, let's go. There we go. Okay, so just the basic learning goals of what's happening here is we're gonna try to get everybody here to a place where we can explain not the details, not the nitty-gritty, but the change, the transformation over the conflict of slavery in American society, right? Fundamentally, why is it that a Republican Party that is 4 years old in 1860, wins a presidential election, sweeps every single northern state, and convinces or organizes a large portion, not a majority, but a large portion of northern society towards radical abolitionist ends? And all that happens within about a decade. From like 1850 to 1860, all that changes. It's a complete and total transformation in American politics, and it happens for material reasons. So we want to be able to explain why that kind of stuff happens. We also want to know, okay, those changes in the conditions lead to big legal and institutional changes and economic changes and demographic changes. So what were those changes, and why did people feel that this was that these actions were necessities? Because in history, basically every single action people are taking, they feel as if they're taking it out of necessity for their own self-interest, especially in any competitive life or death situation. So we want to understand people's motivations and thinking, and get how behavior is motivated by class interest, self-class interest. Okay. And again, we are going to yada yada through about 400 years of history right now. So on your session guide documents, I have a little bit of extra information on each one of those things, just to give like a better idea of what we're talking about here. I also have further reading recommendations for most of these slides, just so I can give you something to go home and maybe read up on. So obviously we know that the Atlantic slave trade began in again, nothing really ever begins or ends, but let's say it started somewhere around the 1300s with the expansion of the Portuguese Empire, and let's say that it went through its high point in the 1700s, the 18th century, under the expansion of the British Empire, which became the largest navy on planet Earth and the largest trading empire in history, and in doing so transported the most amount of African slaves to the American continent. But by the end of that century, about around the 1790s for the United Kingdom, and maybe the 1810s or so, the Anglophone world, which is the English-speaking world, had officially outlawed the Atlantic slave trade. Now, that in and of itself is a lecture. Why that happened materially, why British society goes through that change, is such a big question. I took an entire class on it. And we cannot get into that. But just know that people talk to each other. And every single person that was alive in America at this time knew what was happening everywhere else. And so that's the kind of context we want to be remembering. So two books I recommend on this. One is The Slave Ship by Marcus Rediker. Rediker is I believe he's from the University of Pittsburgh. He has great books about the history of Atlantic slavery. I read a book he wrote about the Amistad and Class Ones. It's a full retelling of the Amistad slave revolt. The Many-Headed Hydra is one of my favorite books. It's a book that basically traces the history of the British Navy and British colonialism through the development of its navy, as well as the development of its navy through the slave trade. And it goes into fascinating details, and tells you a lot about the 18th century and what new and exciting things were happening that allowed this huge empire to come about. Okay, so the conflict over slavery begins with the Constitution. Immediately, there is a necessity to create a compromise with slave states, with small states, and with large states. But really, what we're talking about is between the northern states and southern states. That distinction is going to become more clear with every passing decade. But through this compromise, the southern slavers, and what compromise we're talking about is the 3/5 compromise in the Constitution, which mandates that for the purposes of electoral representation, all chattel slaves will be considered 3/5 of one vote. This is going to allow the southern gentry, the southern slave class, to basically control American politics for the next 60 years. It's going to become a huge problem because the northern population is going to boom within the next 30 years. It's going to eclipse massively the South. But the South is still going to control the Senate. It's still going to control the presidencies without, I think Zachary Taylor is maybe the only non-democratic president of this time period, and he dies within a month of taking office. So we want to recognize the intense political conflict that's going to come about from this. Then in 1820, I believe, the House of Representatives comes up with a grand compromise to fix this issue. They say, okay, let's make it so that slavery or slave states cannot expand above something called the 35th parallel. You might have also heard it known as the Mason-Dixon line. They decide that if we can just kick this can down the road, if we can create this compromise solution, then the southern states, which deeply want to expand slavery, we can't talk about why that is. Just know that the southern states are intensely interested in creating a slave empire. I have written down on these slides and on this book, in your session guide, a book called This Vast Southern Empire by a Yale historian, Matt Karp, who writes about this in particular. And it's a lot of it is a political history of the southern slavers talking to slavers in the Caribbean, in Cuba, in Brazil, and talking about solidifying this plantation system through, let's say, a axis of evil of some kind, and using that political will to expand slavery across the entirety of the western part of the American continent. Now, sometime around in the course of doing so, the southern planter class pushes Congress to invade Mexico in the process of annexing Texas. Obviously, we're yada-yadaing a lot of stuff here. But in doing so, they end up conquering, conquering the entirety of New Mexico. We call this the Mexican Secession under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And this throws a massive wrench within this compromise system we have. Because by 1846, and this is when this happens, there is a growing, first off, there's a growing opposition to slavery on a moral ground. That's a very small minority position. I would call it within the 1% to 5% in 1846. But it is strong within certain states, within especially the New England states like Maine, Massachusetts, places like that. But more than anything else, there becomes a strong economic opposition to slavery by the 1840s, where white yeoman farmers who see the unconquered portions of the American continent, from Indian territory, which is what we are in right now, to California as, let's say, their retirement funds or their inheritance to their children. I think that's a very important theory to understand here, is that so much of the political avenues and the political willpower of this moment is about securing Western land for white children. Not just white children, but for white small land owning families, right? Because there's a massive, the richest people in this country in this time period, because of King Cotton, are the southern land owning class. They have the most amount of wealth in the country by net worth, easily. They are the largest exporters of cotton in the world, the largest producers of cotton on the planet. And to understand the importance of cotton, you got to know that the British Empire in this time period is undergoing the most significant industrial revolution ever. It's the first industrial revolution ever, and the vast majority of that is happening through its textile industries. Textile industries meaning production of clothes, sheets, things like that, all of which require cotton. And the northern economy at this time, well up until like the 1860s, let's say well into the Civil War, the northern economy is also reliant on this. Why? Well, number one, the North has a massive mercantile industry, so shipping cotton is huge, shipbuilding is huge. The financialization of the northern economy is much ahead of the southern economy, which means there are northern insurance brokers, there are northern stock brokers, all of whom are making a lot of money off of the cotton trade. Again, a lot of this you can read more in Matt Karp's This Vast Southern Empire. This map here shows you the density of cotton along the Mississippi Delta, which was acquired through the passage of the Indian Removal Act in 1830 by removing, I believe, the Choctaw and Cherokee tribes from Georgia. And within 20 or 30 years, that entire area of the Mississippi Delta becomes 40 to 50% populated by African slaves. Something people don't realize is that for vast portions of the South, let's say the demographics between white slavers and the enslaved population is very equal. And more than that, not a lot of people own slaves in the South either. So there is a constant threat and a constant fear of this system breaking apart. And that's going to motivate basically all Southern decision-making algorithms well after the war. Okay, so what we need to understand first is that this is a conflict over slavery. It's not a conflict to end slavery, at least right now. As we were talking about, with the Mexican-American War done, there's this massive amount of land, just truly astonishing amount of land that is up for grabs. And legally, within the American legal system, that can just be bought up by whoever is the richest and who can get it. And who's the richest in that society is the people who own slaves, because they have the most amount of capital value, is probably the best way we could say that, right? There comes to be a amendment within Congress to stop the expansion of slavery into these Western states. That's called the Wilmot Proviso. It's very important that the Wilmot Proviso does not pass Congress. It does not get through the door, and it is not successful. It angers a lot of the Northern public and Northern politicians. This is where I would say we can start defining a lot of American politics over these slavery lines. Again, not to abolish slavery, but about where you stand on it. Okay, so as more and more Northerners in particular start to recognize their shared common interests in stopping the expansion of slavery, and even some of them in abolishing slavery, they desert what's called the Whig Party in around the 1850s or so, right? So the Whigs, and let's think if we can think of any parties like this right now. The Whigs were a dying party that could not meet the moment in any way, and rapidly lost support within the span of about a decade, despite the fact that they were Henry Clay, a bunch of people you might have heard of in American history were Whigs, and that coalition splits, and essentially a coalition of a coalition of Northern industrial elites, as well as radical abolitionists, Northern Democrats who mainly live in cities and represent Irish immigrants, sometimes German immigrants, depending on where you are. They decide, okay, because of the Southern states' continued demand to expand slavery again and again and again, we need some way to organize. And because the Whig Party in particular is corrupt, not just corrupt, but unwilling to solve this issue, we need to come up with a new party. And so they do that. They meet in 1856 to form what is now the Republican Party, what is still the Republican Party today. Some nice little anecdotes about this. There was a group called the Wide Awakes, the first woke people. And they basically just little gangs of teenagers, young men who would, Northern men who would stalk Southern plantation owners, Democratic politicians, go to their rallies and just start beating people up, just doing stuff like this, mainly out of anger. This really ramps up towards the second half of the 1850s. Again, if you want to talk about, if you want to learn more about the history of this, great book by Eric Foner called Free Land, Free Labor, Free Men. It talks about the ideology of the early Republican Party, what motivated people to vote for it. Again, within 4 years, a presidential party, a political party is formed, and within 4 years, they captured the presidency, the Senate, and the House of Representatives. And that's because they sweep the Northern electorate. Because why? One is the Homestead Act. The Republican Party runs heavily on the Homestead Act in 1860, which is a law that is going to reserve Western land specifically for smallholding whites. Very, very popular in the North. Very, very unpopular in the South because it disallows slavers from buying that land up. More things to go with this. The Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1850 essentially nationalizes slavery. It says, it repeals the Missouri Compromise, and it says that slavery can keep on expanding past the North. The Dred Scott decision in 1856, I think, also further nationalizes slavery. It essentially rules that Southerners can have slavery wherever they want, despite Northern law. Despite that violating Northern law. So that pisses everybody off. The Compromise of 1850 also includes the Fugitive Slave Act, one of the most reviled acts in American history, and deeply, deeply despised in the North because you just get these bandits, basically, that we could call them. Bandits come up and trying to steal runaway slaves, not even runaway slaves, but just random people. And this was widely despised among all the North. And I think we can think about some things that are happening in Minneapolis and Los Angeles that kind of mirror those specific conflicts where we reach a terminal crisis and people get angrier and angrier over that inability to reach a conclusion, right? Because people are just, why? Because these people's material interests are just so fundamentally misaligned. They can't come to an agreement on it. It's impossible. And then, from the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Compromise of 1850, there becomes this situation known as Bleeding Kansas, which is really the precursor to the Civil War. That's where John Brown really makes his name before he stages a raid on Harper's Ferry and is executed there. That is another huge moment in history because the North goes, this is in 1859, so right before the war. The Northern public goes crazy for this. They love John Brown. They write songs about John Brown, and to the entirety of the South, John Brown is like the biggest domestic terrorist in American history. And so for a lot of Southerners, seeing the entirety of the North essentially say, hey, this guy was great, and maybe the most moral man in American history, for them to see everybody support that, they think, okay, we can't reason with this anymore. It's almost like some secret group has infiltrated Northern society and is telling them all the wrong things. And unless the federal government decides to outlaw abolitionism, and this is actually what the Southerners, this is their last compromise, is make it illegal to be an abolitionist, make it illegal to, say abolitionist things, which obviously doesn't work with the North. But this is where we get to, let's say, a turning point that we really can't come back from. But I hope you guys can all notice, or all recognize, that none of these individual inciting incidents really matter on a fundamental deep level. This could have been anything that started this. What really matters is that for 20 years they couldn't come to any kind of way to settle their material disagreements. One, because the South has a huge incentive to keep on expanding slavery, and the North, all of the North has a huge incentive, especially white Northerners has a huge incentive to stop the expansion of slavery. And both of these people view this as fundamental to the soul of America, essentially. White Northerners believe that if they can't move west, if they can't keep that Jeffersonian ideal going, which means small families owning land or whatever, then American republicanism dies. And Southerners know, because they can see, that slavery is much more profitable in other parts of the world, number one, but also that it requires an expansionist tendency to keep going. And so they can't come to terms with these things because the very nature of them doesn't come out of it, right? The very nature of them can't come to agreement on that. And just a quote from Frederick Douglass about this, to let you know that it doesn't really matter who did Harper's Ferry. It doesn't really matter that Harper's Ferry happened. What matters is that there was a situation where Harper's Ferry could happen, where there was a situation where the raid on Harper's Ferry could happen, and there were the conditions, the cultural hegemonic ideas, right, of the time made it so that the Northern public liked this. And that wasn't a choice of the Northern Northern public in general. That was more a consequence of the last 20 years of their history and what they had gone through and how that had affected their consciousness. Okay, so the war begins. And again, we're going to yada yada through this all. The North and South are both going to go through an immense economic transformation. Obviously, the South is going to go through a total social revolution, and by that I do mean maybe the most significant social revolution in history until the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. We'll talk about this later in terms of the amount of people freed and the amount of and the differences in quality of life and things like that. But both of these societies need to go into full total war mode. They need to rapidly economically industrialize. They need to take loans. They need to invent new financial instruments, which is, if you study economic history, is like the most important thing ever, is finding new ways to give somebody a loan and a new way to take out a loan. Is the history of American capitalism of capitalism in the last 600 years. So the Union Army swells with freed troops, with freed slaves, and as the war continues, the Confederate economy and the Confederate state basically slowly collapses. A lot of military historians always talk about how, like, if the South just used their defensive advantages, they just kept retreating and let the North take attrition and all this kind of stuff. This kind of ignores the fact that if you retreat from your land and all your slaves are freed, why did you fight this war and in the first place, right? So the minute, and in my opinion, the minute that competent generals and competent military leadership on the Union side decides to end this war by ending slavery, which is, let's say, happens around 1862 to 1863, the South suffers loss after loss after loss because the Northern military is no longer so concerned with maintaining the Southern way of life, which they very much were until like 1862. Okay, so what comes out of the Civil War? Well, let's just talk about like the immediate like big legal changes. So obviously the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery, except in the case of a punishment for a crime. Then the 14th Amendment passes through, all the houses of Congress. The 14th Amendment recognizes equal citizenship for all people born in this country. It's where the birthright citizenship clause in the American Constitution comes from. And then finally, the 15th Amendment universalizes suffrage for all males in the country, or all males above the age of 21. Then also there's the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which is, basically the same, some different wordings as the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It's passed over the veto of Andrew Johnson, who became president after Lincoln was assassinated. And I only mentioned that it went over with a veto to kind of explain that, like, by this point, the Republican Party has total control over the country. And that's not a thing you could have imagined happening in 1856. They control every single branch of Congress. They can push through three different amendments to the Constitution, which half the country do not want to happen at all. And then, a further 30% of it, a further 30% of the country thinks it doesn't even matter, and it's kind of a waste of time. So they have total control. The Northern financial elite, which represents, or which the Republican Party represents, really controls America at this point. And before the Civil War, you could not say that. You could easily say that the Southern slave planter class completely controlled the American federal government. And so, in that way, we talk about the Civil War being truly a revolutionary war. One because of its social revolutionary nature in freeing people from servitude on the land, but also a complete and total political revolution as the most hegemonic, most popular party in American history goes down the drain, or goes down the drain until about when Woodrow Wilson is elected in 1914. Okay, so after the war, we get a period of military reconstruction, or there's a little bit of a gap there, but we won't go over that. There's a period of military reconstruction where Union troops occupy the South. Right here on this map, we have the different military districts that each one had a general appointed to who served as the governor of that state. So in this time period, we get Union troops occupying the South to ensure elections can be held with with the full rights of the 15th Amendment protected. And so for the first time, you have freed slaves voting in elections. You have them representing people in office. I believe one black senator enters Congress, and maybe a dozen congressional representatives enter Congress at this time. This keeps going, but what I really want to get is I know we know how this story ends, right? But I think the important thing to get about this time period is the conflict that's happening. You get in this period, you get thousands, hundreds of thousands of freed slaves, a lot of whom served in the Union military, and a lot of whom are now educated because of that, who are literate because of that. A lot of whom are doctors now because of that, surgeons, really, sailors. They not only, for the first time, take a active role in the political life of the country, they also take an active role in organizing Black America. Not the first time that it happened, obviously, but with the expanded protections of the Union military, they start organizing. I mean, within days of the war ending, there are Black schools opening up. There are hospitals with Black surgeons. There are everything, and none of this is happening from the Freedmen's Bureau, though that is going to keep on happening past that. But it's an organic outpour of the desires of freed people at this time period. Then, I don't know why I have 1977 written on this, but in 1877, Rutherford B. Hayes, that scoundrel, in order to win a contested presidential election, agrees to Southern demands to withdraw Union troops from the South, and in doing so, basically formally ends what we consider the Reconstruction era of America. But going on into the future, you're going to continue to see this new conflict emerge between a emergent Black middle class, Black working class as well, that is going to tirelessly try to educate itself. This is when the vast majority of historically Black colleges and universities are made in the late 1880s and 90s and early 1900s. They're going to become doctors and surgeons, and they're going to form organizations like the NAACP. All of these things are, to the people that lived then, happened 20 years ago. A lot of them lived through it. A lot of their parents lived through it. A lot of their parents died in it. So that kind of cultural memory, I think, we need to recognize lasts. When 800,000 people die and the entire country is ravaged, that cultural memory lasts, and it lasts, until the 1950s. The last slave, the last person born into slavery in America, not in other countries, but the last person born into slavery in America died in the mid-1970s. And the last veteran of the Civil War died in the mid-1950s or so. So all this stuff is very recent history to everybody. Okay, we've got about 5 more minutes. We're almost done. Okay, so specifically on what happens in the social reconstruction of Southern society. So, and by the way, I should have been mentioning this, but we're going to go through documents, right, through this later, and I have on these slides basically references to what documents are kind of referring to what time period. That's just an aid. You don't really need to pay attention too much to that. So the first and best book, really, the first best book about Reconstruction is written by W.B. Du Bois in the late 1800s, early 1900s. It's called Black Reconstruction in America, and it's the first, let's say, systematic analysis of what actually happened, socially speaking. It talks about the denial of land redistribution, which was an essential demand and promise that the Union military gave to freed slaves. It was also an essential demand of lots of the northern public. 400,000, maybe 500,000 Union troops died in the war. They didn't exactly want these guys to get their land back. And they didn't exactly want to see Jefferson Davis and Alexander Stephens, who were the president and vice president of the Confederacy, pardoned. These were very unpopular decisions. And I think something that Du Bois really goes on about is how so much of that cultural memory is just erased from our teaching because of the lost cause education system, especially in the South, where we forget about how much animosity there really was between Northern Union soldiers who saw what happened, who saw their friends and brothers die, and decided that okay, if they died, I'm going to make sure that at least some kind of moral or godly value comes out of this. So a lot of them become committed, die-hard abolitionists. That's a very common story, especially with Union officers who start the war not abolitionists, not in any way really political people, and ended as the most fervent radical Republicans. In fact, in 1864, in the presidential election, when it looks like Lincoln is going to lose because of the border states who are pro-slavery, because of the New York draft rights, because of all this kind of stuff, the people that really push him over the top are votes cast by the Union military. They come in from the Army of the Potomac, from General Grant, from Sherman's army down the Mississippi. They get there, and the Union troops vote in droves for the Republican Party. So as this conflict over the land, and that's what we're going to call it. We're going to call it a conflict over who controls the land in the South now, because the freed slaves, what they want is they want their own land. That's an essential demand that they need. They need, because you need land to live, and you need land to be free. That's another thing. In this society, in this time period, if you don't have land, you're not really free. So that doesn't end up happening. And what ensues is what could best be described as a campaign of paramilitary terrorism, or a guerrilla campaign, some could call it, whatever you want to call it. But a level of organized white violence that is certainly nothing like before the Civil War, and is much more clandestine than before the Civil War, but seeks to organize Southern whites, especially plantation-owning whites, into political book clubs, whatever. Literally every form of organization you can think of, the KKK was involved in. Okay, so it was a paramilitary organization, it was a terrorist organization, it was also a book club, it was also a dance club, they also played music and all this kind of stuff, because it's really just about organizing white society against the aspirations of freedmen in this time period. Okay, and we'll keep going. Okay, this is just a bit of a wrap up. Okay, what has changed before the war and after the war? Number one, 4 million people have been freed. Okay, and that happens almost overnight, which is again really insane to think about. It's the largest ever manumittance. Manumittance is the freeing of slaves in Atlantic history. And we don't really count the British one, because that doesn't really count, because they basically passed a law that said you can all be free in 20 years, kind of, and along with that there's a skyrocketing literacy rate. Before the Civil War, people weren't keeping statistics on the literacy rates of slaves, but whatever I've been able to find is something like maybe 10%, maybe. And by the end of the war, by the 1870s or 1880s, that's up to 70 or 80%. That's how quickly that happens. Infant mortality, which is, again, none of these statistics are really being heavily tracked in this time period. But from what we know, the life expectancy of slaves rises through the roof, especially for the hardest laboring slaves, generally minors, not children, miners as in people who mine. Mining was the worst job you could do until the 1980s or 1990s. It still kind of is. So there's this drop in infant mortality, there's a rise in life expectancy, and again, there's this new generation of very, very well-educated freedmen, and then their children who are going to school, who are becoming doctors and lawyers. The most popular black political leader of this time, the post-Civil War era until the early 1900s, is Booker T. Washington, who is today remembered as a very, very conservative figure, and he was a very conservative figure, but his popularity came from his massive push for literacy, not just literacy, but education, and the patronage and the supporting of HBCUs and primary schools for black children, etc. Right? So that's happened. There's a complete and total change in 4 million people's lives. There's now total Republican control over the government, and that's going to last. they're going to keep controlling it until 1917. Then they're going to get back in, and then the New Deal is going to come, and the Republican Party is going to lose all of its support ever. But until Reagan comes back. But for really a shockingly long time period, the Republican Party controls government, and that means the northern industrial bourgeoisie controls government. And in doing so, they craft what we know today as American capitalism, or the American industrial society, because the late 1800s is when that society really matures into being, when you can really say America is fully a capitalist industrialist economy. You can say that it was emerging that way before the Civil War, but it's there after the Civil War. Okay, so we have been talking for a long time now. We're at 4:02, and so everybody please take a 5-minute break to get some snacks, get water, go to the bathroom or whatever. When we get back, we'll start...